evening. Welcome to this conversation with author Jonathan Ned Katz about his book, The Daring Life and Dangerous Times of Eve Adams, co-presented by the Center for Jewish Studies and the Program in Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at Fordham University. My name is Karina Martin Hogan, and I'm Associate Professor in the Theology Department and Director of the Honors Program at Fordham College at Lincoln Center, as well as affiliated faculty member in Jewish Studies and Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies. I'll be facilitating the Q&A after Jonathan's talk, so please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A at any time during the presentation. The chat is disabled, so please use the Q&A function to pose your questions. I am very honored to be taking part in this conversation with Jonathan Ned Katz, who is one of the pioneering scholars of LGBTQ history. Since the 1970s, his books and articles have shown that the categories in which societies think about sexual desire, sexual behavior, and sexual identity are culturally and historically specific. He is the author of 6 books on the history of sexuality: Gay American History, Lesbians and Gay Men in the USA from 1976, Gay Lesbian Almanac from 1983, The Invention of Heterosexuality, 1995, Love Stories, Sex Between Men Before Homosexuality, 2001, Coming of Age in Greenwich Village, 2013, and most recently, The Daring Life and Dangerous Times of Eve Adams, 2021. He has also authored 2 books on Black American history. He has taught classes at Yale University, Eugene Lang College, and NYU, and was the convener of a faculty seminar at Princeton University. He is the founder and director of OutHistory.org, the major website on LGBTQ US history since 2008. He's won several awards for his scholarly contributions to gay and lesbian studies. Please join me in welcoming Jonathan Ned Katz.
I thought I would just give a basic overview of Eve Adams' life first, and then I'd love to hear what kind of questions the audience has. So Eve arrived in the US on June 4, 1912, at the age of 21. And I imagine what it would be like to come from a town in Poland that was perhaps 40,000 people, half Jewish, and arrive in New York City in 1912. It just must have been amazing. It was a 10-day boat ride, and she did come second class because an uncle who had done well in business in the US proceeded to pay her way. She first lived with relatives and then soon moved in with friends. She worked in a ladies' blouse factory in New York and belonged to what was called the Ladies Waist Makers Union. Waist makers, these were a kind of blouse that were really popular at the time. And Eve apparently quite soon joined the organizing work of the famous left radical anarchist Emma Goldman. And she also met early on Emma's partner of the time, Ben Reitman, who became a friend, and he's an important person in Eve's life. He's a complicated person, but he became important in Eve's life, and there are some letters that are very important that they wrote later on in Eve's life. In 1917, 5 years after Eve arrived in the US, on June 4, 1917, she attended an anti-draft rally in which Emma Goldman dramatically declared, quote, "I have only one life to give, and if my life is to be given for the liberation of the people, soldiers, help yourselves." Eve did get to know Emma and became one of the people that she visited later on. when Emma was thrown out of the U.S. In 1918, in February, Eve wrote a fervid fan letter to an actress, Vanya Marenhof, who Eve had seen starring in a free love play in Greenwich Village. And Eve was apparently very turned on by this actress and the part. The part, I looked up the script, and it's a really interesting play in which the main character, Karen, ends by telling her theological father, who's a theologian who's written a book on Christianity, that she walks out of the house in this dramatic exit, and she says, one day we women will be recognized for our own selves, and we won't be facing this kind of patriarchy that her father represents. So Eve was very turned on by this actress, and probably by the play as well. In 1919, Eve started working as a traveling saleswoman of left radical periodicals. They're all different radical persuasions. And a columnist in the newspaper cites Eve as among the increasing number of hoboettes, women who are taking to the road looking for work and adventure. And Eve certainly found adventure in traveling around the US and selling these periodicals. An ad for Eve's sales services, probably written by her, appears in the left journal Good Morning, and stressed, you'll know her by her hair. And she may have dyed her hair red for a while, because a number of people remark on her having red hair, and it's not quite clear to me if she dyed it or not. But perhaps it was, she wanted to stand out, and I think she certainly may have dyed her hair for a while. It also could have been a symbol of her sort of left politics to have red hair as well. In 1919, the first documentation of Eve's surveillance by the US Bureau of Investigation starts then, and this includes the first reference to Eve using the name Eva Adams. That's the first time we get the idea that she's renamed herself. And it's reported that she was believed to be an agitator and organizer for the industrial workers of the world. And that was a militant labor organization that the US government officials had already taken active, largely successful steps to crush. And so I think it's important to note that the US government got on Eve's tail because she was for her radical activities. And only later on do they use other reasons to go after her. Agents at that time in the first account searched Eve's hotel room where she's going around selling these periodicals, and they confiscated some of her belongings and some printed literature and subscription blanks to radical publications. And I mean, there was absolutely no due process for what the US Constitution says about right to not have your possessions searched and seized. They did exactly that, these agents of the US government. In 1921, there's a story about Eve in a Minnesota socialist newspaper in which They describe Eve as follows. Eve Adams, the celebrated hiker who sets out for a 75-mile stroll in the morning and winds up with a swim across the English Channel in the evening, is on the trail of artists and students and all kinds of people to get them to take subscriptions to these different radical periodicals. And this description continues, quote, Miss Adams has the reputation of having gotten more subscriptions for these publications than any other living Bolshevik in captivity. I think that Eve's politics, which are never really completely defined by her, I think probably they amounted to sort of what I would describe as left radical. A bit of anarchism, a bit of socialism, a variety of influences. In 1922, the first ad for a Chicago bohemian resort appears in a Chicago newspaper. It's called the Great Cottage, and Eve and a woman partner named Ruth Norlander opened this bohemian hangout, and there's an ad for the Great Cottage the next month that it describes it as Chicago's Greenwich Village tea room, Eve Adams and Ruth Norlander in charge. And I think that in charge and the two women's names is a hint that this is a place that would welcome queer people of various varieties, as well as all kinds of bohemian artists and poets and writers. And Ruth Norlander appears to have been a really beloved partner of Eve's and a romantic partner. And she, in fact, was a painter. And she, in 1922, exhibited 2 nudes in a no jury exhibit in Chicago. And there may have been a nude of Eve, because Eve posed for her, and Eve mentions that in a later letter to Norlander. So I'm hoping that maybe some more material will show up after the word gets around about Eve Adams' life and people start doing more research on what happened to her. In 1923, Eve seems to have broken up with Ruth Norlander as a partner and come back to New York, where she signs a declaration of her intention to become a US citizen. But Eve never completed her citizenship application, and it's too bad, because she would have had more protections against the US government attempt to get rid of her and to persecute her, really. So there would have been more rights that she would have had if she had ever become a full citizen. In 1924, the first documentation of Eve participating in the operation of a Greenwich Village rendezvous appears in a guide to Greenwich Village businesses. And in 1925, Eve publishes a book called Lesbian Love. And it's an amazing book. It's the first book by a lesbian about lesbians that was published in the US. I call it it's a community study by a participant observer. People have called it called it stories, but I think that gives the idea that it's fiction. It's not. I don't think it's fiction. Eve says very clearly that the book is based on stories, or not stories, but depictions of women, all different kinds of women that she had met in her various travels and in New York and Chicago. And I think that's what it is. It's an early community study. I think that best describes it. And in 1925, in a first listing for Eve's Hangout appeared in June in Mr. Quill's Guide. It's a guide to Greenwich Village businesses. And so Eve has sort of named this thing and taken over this she's running this place called Eve's Hangout. And it becomes quite famous in the not long time that it was open, but she seems to have attracted a lot of attention, and people, heard about it and went to it as a friendly bohemian place to go in Greenwich Village. Around 1925, a man named J. Fitzpatrick says that he had reported the undesirability of Eve to the New York City police, the women police, head of the women police in New York, and that the police had opened a file on Eve. I wasn't able to find that, but perhaps someone will be able someday to find that file if it still exists. And it's not clear why this guy Fitzpatrick had it out for Eve. Importantly, in 1925, also, Eve on the US Census declares herself a writer. I really like that. She had written this book and she called herself a writer. She was thinking of herself and declaring that that's who she was. A little later in 1925, this guy Fitzpatrick goes to Ellis Island and swears out a testimony against Eve, saying this is to the federal authorities. And he says he saw Eve engage in sex acts with women and suggests that she was getting paid for sex as a prostitute, which are rationales for Eve's future deportation, because the law said, the US immigration law said that you could be deported if you came to the US and were a prostitute. This suggests that Fitzpatrick was cooperating with federal immigration officials to build a case against Eve, although there's no direct evidence of this. I as a historian, very strongly find it really important to distinguish what I have evidence for and what I need to speculate about. I think that's really important these days, where these days of alternate facts, we should be very clear what we have evidence for. On 1925, 1925, in September, the US Immigration Service issues Eve a return permit, and she goes to visit her family in Poland and then returns after quite a quick visit. And there's a wonderful photo of Eve Adams with her in Poland with her brother Jerachmiel and probably her sister Toby, that was taken at this time. In June 1926, there's a listing for Eve's Hangout in the Quill, which describes it in a very negative way for the first time. It says, quote, "where ladies prefer each other, not very healthy for the she adolescents, nor comfortable for he men." So that was an indication that Eve's was getting known as a place that for queer people especially, and that this newspaper was warning people about that. On June 17th, not longer after that ad appeared, or that description of her, wasn't an ad, it was a description of Eve's hangout. Eve was arrested on June 17th, and she's held in prison through her first trial for indecent book. That's her book on lesbian love. And she is still in jail for her second trial, which was for disorderly conduct, which was allegedly attempting to have sex with this police woman who had been sent in to entrap her, actually. Eve is found guilty of both charges and spent about a year and a half in the women's prison on Welfare Island. And the judge who found Eve guilty of publishing an indecent book privately asked the head of the parole commission, who will be deciding how long she'll be in jail, to take up the matter of deporting Eve. So there's really a documented conspiracy between these various, the judge and this parole guy and the head of this parole commission and various federal officials, suggesting that there's a definite sort of collusion on their part to begin the process by which Eve would eventually get deported after her prison term. Eve's first deportation hearing concludes with her asking for a lawyer to be present, and her last and fourth deportation hearing, this happens while she was still in jail. It's held without her lawyer present. This hearing that would decide Eve's future proceeded without her having any counsel present. Due process be damned. And so despite Eve's lawyers, contacting federal officials, the immigration officials, and saying that a relative will provide a bond for her, that it doesn't work. Commissioner General of Immigration writes to Eve's lawyer saying that her case was very carefully considered and that the alien's removal from the United States will be effected as soon as possible after she is released from prison. So on December 7th, 1927, Eve was deported. And strangely, on the day she was deported, a federal official reports that the copy of Lesbian Love, Eve's book, that was in the files has mysteriously disappeared. So apparently some of one of these federal officials, guys, they were all guys, actually just took her book for his enjoyment. So I think that's an amazing piece of irony. So Eve is first deported to Poland. She arrives in Poland and she had a number of different kinds of jobs to just make a small living. And she finally makes it to Paris after a couple of years. So by around 1930, she has arrived in Paris. And she then began to make a living by selling what were considered dirty books by James Joyce, by D.H. Lawrence, by Henry Miller. American tourists and English-speaking tourists from England also would go to Paris and then buy copies of these books in English that weren't available in their own countries. So he was able to make a small living by selling these books to tourists. And she becomes friends with Henry Miller, quite friendly. And there's some wonderful descriptions of their relationship. And around 1933, Eve writes to Ben Reitman. There's a series of wonderful letters that we have that Ben Reitman preserved in his archive, which is in Chicago. So there's about 5 of these letters. Some of them are fairly long. And Eve, so that's how we know about Eve's life, or one of the main ways we know about Eve's life in Europe. She begins to be known among the bohemians in Europe, and she becomes like a sort of famous character that she's mythologized, I'll say. Her life was very dramatic, and so it sort of fit into being made the subject of sort of a mythology. So these various stories about her begin to appear in different papers. And there's an American columnist named Wombley Bald, a very strange name, wrote a column about Eve in Paris. And it's the only public praise for Eve's book, Lesbian Love, that was published in her lifetime. I think that's so interesting that this heterosexual man would be one of the ones who wasn't afraid to praise Eve's book. And he hopes that the US won't throw people out of the country for doing such harmless things. It's quite an amazing, very brief, but an amazing defense of Eve. And then Eve in 1933 meets a woman who is a singer in Paris cafes, and Hella Olstein, her name is. She sings under the name of Nora Warren, to play down her Jewishness and to get jobs as a singer. And it's certainly, I think, Eve was certainly entranced with Hella, and they are longtime companions. It's not exactly clear what the nature of this intimacy was. It certainly was an intimacy. And they spend 10 years together. And unfortunately, in 1940, the Nazis invade Paris. Eve and Hella flee to the south, and they go to Nice, and they are able to evade the Nazis for 3 years. People are being arrested all over the place. There's resistance, and there's terrible, arrests and horrible treatment by the Germans of people in France, and finally, Eve and Hella are both arrested, and it's documented that they were taken on transportation 63 from the Drancy camp, holding camp in a suburb of Paris, to Auschwitz-Birkenau, and they they did not survive. They were not one of the very few women survivors who were on Transport 63. So that was their fate. So of course, I wanted to talk about Eve, the importance of the horrible ending of her life, but I didn't want to present her only as a Holocaust victim. She was this active, amazing, pioneering, open lesbian at a time when not many women were willing to be open. It was a very daring act for her to be so open about her sexuality and to write this book and to open these different cafes that were clearly welcoming to lesbians and gay men. And so that's about what I'd like to present. I'd be really interested in discussing Eve's life further with all of you.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. It was a wonderful, brief presentation of a very rich book, which I enjoyed reading so much, twice, once when it first came out last summer, and then just before this presentation, there it is. And notice it also, for those of you who are thinking about buying the book, it also includes the text of Lesbian Love. So the first question I wanted to actually ask you, Jonathan, is about your discovery of that text, which apparently had sort of gotten lost, right? There really weren't any copies in libraries or anything. And I just wondered at what point in your research you were able to finally get your hands on her book, and how did that change your view of Eve reading her own writing?
Yeah, it was thrilling to finally come across a copy of the book. I'll tell you, there was one copy of Eve's book in the Yale Library. It disappeared mysteriously. Yale doesn't know what happened to it. I guess it was stolen. So Barbara Kahn, a playwright, started writing some plays about Eve Adams after a bit about Eve appeared in the book Gay New York, about New York City gay history. And then a wonderful researcher who worked with Barbara Kahn to look for material and did find important documents about Eve. And because Barbara Kahn's plays were publicized on the internet, a woman wrote to Barbara and said, I came home one night as a student when I was in Albany, and in the lobby of my building was this book called Lesbian Love. Somebody had left it in the lobby and, to discard. And she picked it up. Looked interesting. And it is indeed the only known copy that of Lesbian Love. So I was able to get to the woman who had found the book, and 20 years earlier she had found the book, and I convinced her I was on the up and up as a historian. And people who began to learn about Eve sort of had this protective thing. Barbara did, and the woman who found the book, Lesbian Love. So that's how I came upon it. When I first read it, I said, oh, well, this is amazing because of these different images of women that Eve knew that she's writing about. It's quite a variety of different classes. It's not racially mixed, but it's mixed in terms of class, which is really interesting. And I thought this is a pretty good book. Eve wasn't great, wasn't perfect in English when she wrote the book. And there's lots and lots of typos, which I insisted that the publisher, when they reprinted the book in my biography of Eve, that they maintain, because I think they're very important. That shows that Eve, no one else helped Eve on this book. All of the mistakes in English, sort of some odd word choices and grammar and typos appear in this book. And I thought it's really interesting to important to preserve those mistakes, to show that this was really Eve talking. Nobody had fixed up the book for her.
Thank you. So I just want to encourage our audience members to continue putting questions in the Q&A, but I have one or two more questions for you, Jonathan, before we open it up to everyone else. So could you tell us just a little more about how researching Eve Adams' life was different from other projects you've undertaken? And I think I remember you mentioning that when you started, you thought you might be working on an article, but at what point did you realize, no, this is really going to be a book?
Yes, well, as I started to research Eve's life, I found more and more material, and it got to be bigger than an article. I realized, and this was such interesting material. So that was really how I came to write it as a book. And I must say that there was wonderful cooperation among Barbara Kahn was very helpful. Through her, I got to Eve's group. I think his grandfather was Eve's brother, and he lives, Eran Zahavi lives in Israel, and he was very, very helpful. He had some documents that his grandfather had saved, and also it was Eran who reached out to try to find the family of Hella Olstein's, Eve's companion, and he was able to find them. And they said, "Oh yes, we have in the closet a whole batch of letters and some photographs of Eve, and Eve signed on to some letters that Hella wrote her family in Switzerland." And so this was very late in my research. So I said to Eran, "I can't believe what you've discovered. This is amazing." So I'd like to stress this international aspect of this research, which on my part was mostly done on the internet by my writing to libraries, emailing libraries, but I did not go out of my house basically to do the research, which certainly was different from the way I had done research in the past on my earlier books. And it's not a great, I mean, it is great. A friend of mine keeps stressing me, "You've got to go to the library and actually check the documents, because you can't depend on the that what the documents contain has been clearly enough and listed." And he's absolutely right. Really, just that I guess I hope that other people will find documents that I didn't find by going to the archives and searching. I think that Ben Reitman's archive, which is huge, it's in Chicago, that it may contain a couple of pictures of Eve that have gotten sort of mixed up in this mixed up collection, and or maybe some other material there. So that's one place that there might be more material. I urge people to try to do more research on Eve. And on Out History, I've put a very detailed chronology of all the documentation of her life, and a teaching guide how Eve's life might be included in classes that are taught in college. So on Out History, there's lots of wonderful material about Eve's life, as well as in the biography itself.
Yeah, I just put the link to Out History in the chat for people who want to check that out. Oh yeah, Magda just put the link as well, more specific link. So I have one more question about the final chapter of your book. You mentioned in the epilogue that was, kind of a painful experience, and I wonder about, how you discovered that she was on Transport 63, and then how did you find that there were other survivors who had recollections, and what was that like, sort of reading through that material and thinking about Eve once you had gotten to know her so much from her?
Yes. Well, that she was on Transport 63 is in the Shoah Memorial in Paris. So that wasn't hard to find. It was one of the easier things to find. Yeah, the epilogue. So what are you asking me about the epilogue?
Oh, not the epilogue. You just mentioned in the epilogue that, your own feelings about the Holocaust were kind of stirred up by this experience of thinking
Yes.
about her on that transport.
Yeah. Yeah. I felt that Eve had become a friend. I felt I'd gotten to know her, and that there's her picture from 1941, which is a passport photo. She looks like just anybody that could have been in the very modern looking or contemporary looking image of her. And it was hard to imagine her. There's these very detailed descriptions from 3 people who survived Auschwitz about what it was like on these transports from Paris to Auschwitz. And it was the beginning of the torture and horrible treatment. And it gave me a real sense, these 3 descriptions gave me a real sense of what the persecution meant in very concrete terms. Not enough food, not enough air, too many people squashed into these cattle cars. It was really disgusting. So it was really upsetting to read these descriptions. It made Eve's tragic end really real to me in a very direct way.
Mm-hmm. So I'm turning now to the Q&A. Several people are commenting about the amazing life that she had, and that someone ought to make a movie or write a play or something. I guess somebody has written a play about it, but one of the questions is asking a little more about her connections in New York. Was she part of any lesbian networks that you know of, or other women in New York that she was involved with or in dialogue with when she was living in Greenwich Village?
Yeah, well, she clearly was in touch with a lot of lesbians, and she writes about them without naming them, of course, but she says that these are real people that she's portrayed in her book, that they're each description, she says, is based on someone she knew. So she was clearly in touch with lots of interesting lesbians. And as well as gay men. There's one scene in Eve's book where a gay man comes in, and the lesbians are sort of relieved when he leaves. They feel freer to sing and have a good time when he's not there. But and there are descriptions of poetry reading, wild poetry reading in Eve's Cafe in Greenwich Village. So it was not just a queer place, but it was a bohemian place that was quite well known and popular. And in the short time that Eve's Cafe or tea room, they were called at the time, in Chicago was open, and the short time that the New York one was open, they seemed to have gained quite a bit of fame, really. You get that sense from the various documents. So Eve was definitely in touch with the numbers of lesbians in New York City.
Great, thank you. Another audience member asked, I guess, more generally about your work. Have you found that gay relationships between men have more evidence in the historical record than lesbian relationships, or that fairly equally obscured?
Oh, sure. It's much easier to find information about men. Just it's part of men having more power generally, although it differs by class, of course. So I made that very clear in my first book, Gay American History, Lesbians and Gay Men in the USA. I put next to the lesbian material, I put a female sign so that people could see that sign and then go directly to that material. I was trying to counter this fact that if you're doing the research more easily, you encounter. Oh, sorry. I'm sorry, I didn't turn off my phone. A new problem. So where was I? What was I saying?
Finding more about men.
Oh, sure, sure. Yeah, so you have to find material about transgender people, to find it about African American queer people. You have to make a special effort because the information about research about white people it's more available. So you do have to be very conscious and then think, well, how can I make a special effort to find this more difficult to find material?
Mm-hmm. So you had mentioned that, the Nazis were not necessarily interested in gay women, right? They were going after gay men. So do you think that it was easier for women to kind of sort of pass in the world and not be noticed as lesbians at that time?
Yeah, well, the law in Germany only made it criminal for men to have sex with men. But historians are recently doing more and more research on the fate of lesbians in Germany during the rise of the fascism and during that period, and they're finding more and more material. So there are various ways that people's lives were definitely, lesbian lives were impacted, sure, by this normalization regime, that wanted to procreate for, more and more little Nazis.
Yeah. Can you tell us how, when, and why she took the name Eve Adams?
Oh, I say that it certainly fits the descriptions of her as a little bit of Eve and a little bit of Adam. She was sort of androgynous. So I thought, oh, it's the perfect name. And, so these are, famous characters, Eve and Adam. And she wanted a name that Americans could remember and pronounce. Her Polish name is Kawa Zlotyshewa, and I hope I pronounced it right. It's hard to pronounce Polish for Americans, so that was a big reason that she took this name. She did it, I think, when she was selling these radical periodicals and going around the country.
Okay, interesting. Another person asks, is it known if Eve considered emigrating to the Soviet Union? Was that an option for her once she had been deported? And has she written about Stalin? She
writes to her brother in Israel that she is thinking of going. She's hoping she's thinking of going to, well, it's Palestine then when she's writing. She's thinking of either going there, which he's urging her to do, but it requires money, she says, and you need to be able to take time off from work. And and she's also thinking of going to Russia she has the idea that these are places where new things are happening, new ways of living are being pioneered, and she thinks she's attracted to that. In the same way, I think that she was attracted to the US. She loved her life here. She experienced a kind of freedom in the US to be who she wanted to be, even though US government officials torpedoed that freedom for her. Mm-hmm. As soon as they really were out to get her. Having, again, I'd say, caught on to her because of her radical connections, her links to Emma Goldman and Alexander Berkman, but then using the fact that she'd written this book called Lesbian Love as the main evidence against her, and sending in this policeman to claim that Eve tried to have sex with her, So they were clearly setting her up to be gotten rid of.
So you think that they really wanted to get rid of her because of her politics more than the book, or do you think it was both?
It starts out with the politics, and the book certainly didn't help, but it was really the politics. They wanted to get rid of these radicals out of the country. These radicals were for workers. They were for unions. Mm-hmm. That's what the main thing that they were for in the US. The International Workers of the World, IWW, was an amazing organization. It was attempted to bring together workers of different races. It was really pioneering, and the US government did its best to, and actually did away with it. They really went after it.
Mm-hmm. So one of our questioners along those lines is asking, how influential was Eve Adams in the labor movement and in socialist circles?
Yeah, that's a good question. She was certainly known by Max Eastman, who edited The Masses early on, and known by some of the other major socialist leaders and anarchist leaders. She was, as I said, friends with Emma and Alexander Berkman and Ben Reitman, and she was sort of mythologized in that socialist paper that I mentioned. So she was known. I don't know how well known, but again, I hope maybe more research will turn up. I'd love to know more about that union. She was part of the Ladies Waste Makers Union in New York City. I'd love to know more about that union because it was all women. And Eve arrived. It was the year 1912. It was the year after the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. It was a year after that terrible, terrible fire in this building where many young women, just like Eve, were killed and jumping out windows to get out of the fire, and horrible.
Yeah. Wow. Could you speak a little to Eve's connection with her religion? Did she ever talk about what it was to be like, what it was like to be both queer and a Jewish woman?
She talks about it in terms of Poland. When she's sent back to Poland, she writes to Reitman about how unfair it is for Jews in Poland, how much anti-Semitism there is in Poland. And she says it's so hard to make a decent living because I'm Jewish. And here I am sent back to this country where I have so much going against me because I'm Jewish. So she stresses that in this letter to Reitman. Even though she was friends with Emma Goldman, who was an atheist and was quite vocal about it, Eve apparently remained a believer in because she talks in, and things she says in her letters to Ben Reitman indicate that, as I discuss in my book. So she definitely remained a believer despite her friendship with Emma. I found that really interesting. Eve went her own way in many different kinds of ways. She was her own person. She could hang out with its notorious atheists and yet maintain some kind of religious Jewish belief, which I found fascinating.
That is fascinating, yeah.
Mm.
Another questioner is asking about the fact that her book was privately printed. She's saying that this wasn't unusual in the 1800s, but was becoming more unusual in the 20th century. So how did you find out, or what did you find out about the publication context?
Yes. Oh, I'd love to know more. We don't know who printed it for her. She's asked about that. Who published your book for you? And she says, I can't, I'm not telling. In her deportation hearings, which are quite detailed, by the way. So she says that it says it was printed in just a few copies. That was 150 copies. And that's stressed because the law against obscenity said if your work was obscene if it influenced, the idea was that if it influenced lots of people. So there was that phrase that was put into books. It was only in 150 copies. So how could it be obscene? Because it couldn't influence very many people. And Eve says in her deportation hearing that it was for artists and bohemians in Greenwich Village. She's sort of limiting its audience. So there's not much known. I'd love to. She was in touch with Mother Earth Press, which was Emma Goldman's press that published Alexander Berkman's a memoir of his years in prison. And it could have been them, but Eve wasn't snitching on her friends. Good for her.
She didn't name any names, right?
She didn't name names. No.
All right. I just want to encourage our audience, if you have any more questions, to please add them to the Q&A, because we have come to the end of the questions in the Q&A. But I have another question, or it's not really a question. I just wanted to ask you if you could tell our audience the story of when she met Mae West, because I thought that was a great story.
Yes. It's amazing. Eve was sent to jail. And in the same jail, Mae West is sent because Mae West has put on a play on Broadway that was found to be obscene. It was called Sex. And, and there was a lot of publicity about Mae West going to jail and getting special treatment, which I'm sure Eve didn't get because Mae West was famous. And Mae West wrote about her time in jail, published a short piece about it. She doesn't mention Eve, but the idea, Eve says in her testimony in her deportation hearing that she met Mae West in jail and told her about being in jail for the same reason that Mae West was in jail, and that Mae West, felt, commiserated with her. So I was fascinated by the idea that Eve, this bohemian character, met up with this Broadway provocateur, sex radical. I mean, they were both sex radicals, so that makes sense. It was, it was just an amazing meeting. It would be great if there was ever a documentary done or a play about you to have them.
Wouldn't that be an amazing play?
It would be a great.
We actually put on the Fordham Theater put on Mae West's play The Drag last semester. So that's just
Oh.
an interesting connection
Oh,
there.
yeah. I think that play developed out of sort of as a development out of these earlier plays of Mae West.
Interesting. All right, one more question has come in, which actually occurred to me when I was reading the book too, because of the people she knew. Do you happen to know if she would have known Dorothy Day or Eugene O'Neill? They're also part of that sort of Greenwich Village scene.
There's no mention of either of those people. There might be a distant connection to Dorothy Day, just that Day, I think, was in Chicago around the same time as Eve, and there was some sort of commotion that went on in Eve's cafe in Chicago. I could tell this person more about this if they contacted me on Out History. The email address is there. Yeah, but it's a very distant possibility.
All right. Well, I think we have come to the end of our questions. So thank you so much for this wonderful, engaging conversation and presentation. And I certainly enjoyed learning more about Eve Adams in this conversation and meeting you.
I hope that people will enjoy reading about Eve. Here, there's her picture.
Yes,
there's the 1941 picture that I love so much, that she just looks like one of my pals from now. Yeah, she's one of us.
She's one of us. That's a good way to end. So please do buy the book if you haven't read it yet, and enjoy learning about an amazing person from the past. All right. Thank you so much, Jonathan, for this wonderful presentation.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks.